Morning to everyone. If people can just take their seats and we will make a start.
I don't hear Richard. Oh. It's working.
Sorry?
Are the all microphones on at the same time?
Hello. It's working.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this session on hybrid regimes and new challenges for civil society. My name is Richard Youngs. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this morning's session. We talked a lot yesterday about the general state of play in the Eastern Partnership. The idea of this session this morning is to get a little bit more analytical and to talk about the different nature of the political regimes in Eastern Partnership countries and try to explore what this means for civil society. So to try and explain the evolving power structures and relations and how these differ between the different Eastern partner countries, and try to develop from that recommendations in terms of what this means for how support for civil society can be made more effective. We have a large panel again, so I'll introduce them very quickly. Marie Mendras is at Sciences Po in Paris. Mikhail Minakov is president of the Foundation for Good Politics in Ukraine. Elena Korosteleva is University of Kent. Orysia Letsuvich is at Chatham House. Denis Malentsu is at the Belarus Institute for Strategic Studies. Katerina Pishikova is at Cornell. And Vera Rykova is at Europeum in Prague. We'll start with Marie, who wanted to say a few words about the way that the structures of the political regimes in Eastern Partner countries owes a lot to the way that Russia acts in the region. Very briefly, Marie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, clearly Russia is an important factor. And Russia is not a hybrid regime, but it's a self-asserted, authoritarian, clientelistic regime. But that is losing steam. And this is, I think, what is interesting for us if we want to look forward. Economic slowdown in Russia, more and more social anxiety about the future, and more political contest. And that will continue. So I think Vladimir Putin and his networks do need the reassurance of a cordon of other non-democratic governments, and that need to rely on him and Russia's resources. So he needs them, I think, as much as they need him. Thinking of the Azerbaijani regime or the Yanukovych regime, Lukashenko in Belarus. I'd like us to think in terms of interdependence of those regimes rather than just Russia's domination of the region. In Russia, it's not just civil society becoming more visible, but it's really, a genuine discontent inside society, and also, I believe, amongst economic and business actors. It seems to me that yesterday we maybe didn't put that much emphasis on economic actors, small and medium business, which I would say is certainly a key factor in the future, and certainly that the Eastern Partnership in the EU should put more emphasis on. All of those non-democratic regimes, Russia included, have very short-term strategies. They cannot quite afford to have long-term strategies, because long-term they see that their regimes will get weaker and will get more contested. I would like to say also that preparing for this Eastern Partnership summit, I have followed, Russian official positions, and I think Russia has been surprised to see the European Union welcome and work hard on a new start with Moldova and Georgia. Because for the reasons we discussed yesterday, those two countries have territorial problems, sovereignty problems, because of the territorial disputes, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria. And you know very well that one of Putin's objectives in the Georgia war and in investing so much in those small territories, one of the ideas is that it would make it impossible for the EU and also for NATO to move closer to countries that are not fully sovereign over the entire national territory. So the fact that we, the EU, have moved forward with those two countries, and that the one that is stepping aside, Ukraine, is a bigger country with no territorial problem, which certainly has a more assured sovereignty, I think reinforces my paradigm of the key factor of the nature of the political elite, the nature of political rule that creates more and more obstacle, but more and more dissociated from the economic, political, and social reality in those countries. So I think, in conclusion, the three factors that will make a difference in the coming years will be the rise of social discontent because of corruption, political and economic corruption, and the rise of political protest in all those countries, Russia included. A second factor will be the economic support that we can provide for small and medium business. And the third big factor will be changes in Russia that will occur, and how to follow those development and support independent actors as much as we can, and show the Eastern Partnership countries that we can work with them, and at the same time engage with Russian actors, but in a new way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So that's one factor. That's the Russian factor and the interpenetration that Russia has at a variety of levels, not just state-to-state level. Michael, Marie talked about the very short-term nature of power strategies of the different regimes in the region. How does that resonate with your work at the cutting edge of civil society activity, specifically in Ukraine?
Well, I fully agree with Marie that the rule is really, the strategies behind the current regimes is very short-sighted. Well, yesterday I was rereading articles written by scholars and politicians 22 years ago. That's exactly when Soviet Union was splitting into parts. And at that time, in Georgia and in Ukraine, in Russia and in Kyrgyzstan, we all thought that our ways are parting, where we will move in our own direction with democracies, but with national shape. 22 years after, we witness pretty much the same framework of authoritarian regimes. Basically the same short-sightedness, basically the same systemic corruption, basically systemic disruption of internal dialogue between civil society and political class. Well, again, I'm probably growing old, so 9 years old, I remember these days on Maidan. And again, what were our expectations? Democratic future. We finally got it. We finally forced political class to be back into dialogue with civil society. Well, in 2010, what we see. The second round of elections, presidential elections in Ukraine, two champions who are not friends of democracy. Two different types of authoritarian future. Well, one of these authoritarian projects is implemented. Well, in 2012, during parliamentary elections in Ukraine, we didn't hear the word of democracy in debates of Ukrainian politicians. Basically, my analysis of my colleagues showed that democracy was not on political agenda anymore. This year, we saw the critical difference. This year, due to this utopian thinking behind association with EU, democracy was back on political agenda. And it was civil society that was pushing it back. It was pro-democracy journalists, it was pro-democracy scholars, and pro-democracy civil society leaders. At the same time, this slap in the face that we got about a week ago made it all different. So Euromaidan shows that the dialogue in Ukraine was disrupted, that civil society requests this dialogue to be back. Civil society and society at large requests new social contract. Last 3 years, the promised reforms have made social, economic, and political life even worse. So, the new social contract is the issue. And it's exactly the civil society that tries to bring it in. And here we come to the situation when civil society may have a bigger hit next year, because next year is going to be ruled by the logic of political campaign, the presidential campaign. Now, with EU association agreement not signed, the favorite of this campaign will have to do some more harsher campaigning, which will critically be reflected on state in civil society organizations. We will see problems with political pluralism next year, we will see problems with free media, and we will see limitations for civil society organizations. And connected with that, I have certain recommendations, and maybe we will discuss them a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to the recommendations in a second phase. But there's some very sobering lessons there of how one can have formal democratic change, but some of the underlying authoritarian power structures can persist for quite a long time. And I think this is an excellent point that some of these hybrid regimes that have a hybrid mix of democracy and authoritarianism, lack fundamentally different social contracts between their societies and political regimes. Elena has been thinking about the Eastern Partnership in general, but also specifically of some of the challenges that these persistent political dynamics raise for civil society. Elena, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. In my position, I would like to add a little bit of academic dimension to begin with, and then I apply to the cases of some countries, and in particular Belarus, which is close to my heart. And here, what I would like to say is that civil society, sort of shift focus now on civil society. Civil society is, as we all know, is a very powerful instrument. But unfortunately, it is still very much an underutilized instrument. And what we need to know about it is that it's, in itself, it's not of that great importance, but what it produces, the social capital that perhaps, scholars like Putnam talks about, that what actually is important. And instead of going 22 years ago and looking at the scholarship, I actually went 2,000 years ago and looked at Aristotle, who looked at civil society, and what he suggested that, first of all, it's a community based on shared sets of norms and ethos in which free citizens are active and willing to participate under the rule of law. So I thought, well, here we go. If we are to apply it to the current day kind of realities in the Eastern region, we clearly have some missing variables here. Well, first of all, community, and then shared values, norms, and also inclusive participation and connectivity. And I'll just very briefly unpack these four that I've outlined. So community, looking at the Eastern region, what we essentially have is still very much a disjointed picture. And national platforms which were put together as an instrument, their purpose was actually to bring all these disparate voices together to ensure that when they come together, they would be a very powerful lobbying instrument to actually let the EU know what we all need rather than the EU coming with its own agenda. So that is very much still a project in the making, and I think this is something that perhaps we should focus in the very near future. Then in terms of shared norms and ethos, as Aristotle imagined, we very much have shared aims indeed, but no so much shared norms or ethos as our recent research, for example, in Belarus, or most recently in Moldova in November actually showed. And we still very much work in our individual silos, and there is very little dialogue and interaction between various voices within the societies. Moving on to inclusive participation, and this is actually the fault of the EU in some ways, because what we have, like in case of Ukraine, there was the case of selective justice when one-person justice was actually very much pushed forward. So in case when there is this funding agenda, yet again we have a case of selective participation, which is set by the EU norms and criteria as to who could actually apply and how they can apply. So that basically they're very much framing the game, whereas I think we're still missing that kind of diversity of various actors who are there on the ground, who may not necessarily fit the criteria put together by the EU. And finally, connectivity. I think this is the most important point, because what we've done so far in Belarus, we kind of put some interesting experiments together. We kind of run this, tried and had to have this kind of reality check, but not outside the country, but actually in the country itself. And Vilnius was part of it. And it actually worked surprisingly well. We brought together diplomats. There were some members from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We had academics. We had think tanks, all at the round table sitting together, actually discussing. We didn't talk about the problems of Eastern partnerships. We talked about the success stories and also what needs to be done. But invariably and inevitably, problems obviously came up. And there was an open dialogue and discussion. And I think that would actually work really well when we had all this within the country. So connectivity is very important. When actually the EU come to work with local agents who actually know how to work the system, and that's most important, because if they know how to work the system to their advantage, bypassing all these obstacles that are set by the system to deter democracy promotion, that's when I think the success is there. And just the very final point that I would like to raise here is I think we should put much more emphasis on the educational dimension, not because I'm an educator myself, but because we need to use that instrument not just for the students, but also for the wider participation. And emphasis not to take the students outside the country, but rather actually make changes, introduce changes within the country. And this is most important because by opening it to the people, involving them through friends of students, through families of students within the universities. I think this way we can ensure wider dialogue, wider participation. And also having, for example, citizens' juries, one of the perhaps most effective instruments that was set up by DFID in the UK, and it really proved so successful because when we invite local participants in their local communities to discuss their local problems and to see how they actually can work and what they can actually demand from their local authorities in the sense of keeping them to the account, then it can be then extrapolated to much higher level nationally or across the whole region. And I think the Eastern Partnership Advancement Center that was put together by the Office of Democratic Belarus to have that kind of local representation and act as a kind of lobbying force in terms of pushing for the educational dimension, also working with local actors to ensure how they actually can lobby the EU body of all these multi-level agents, and also having the knowledge and recognition of themselves as a very powerful force. I think this is one of the most important steps forward.
Excellent, some great practical ideas. Odysseus, Elena's concept of silos, of civil society actors often working in quite separate silos, is one that is very often picked up. There's obviously a strong consensus here that more needs to be done to support civil society, but we know it's a bit more complicated than that civil society faces its own challenges of how it can be better connected downwards to general public opinion and also upwards into state authorities. What can we do to try and articulate these linkages, these connections more effectively?
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you, the organizers, because I really enjoy seeing in the room so many great minds and hearts of civil society in Eastern Partnership region. Through my travels to Armenia and to Moldova and to Azerbaijan, you know, I've met all these great people, and I think what is important is really to hear your feedback on what we say, so I try to be brief. I wish I had this magic bullet about really how to do it and support civil society, and I've been thinking recently for the last 2 years, working with Chatham House a lot about the issue. I mean, what makes me happy is, of course, that what I see, this expression of people power again in Ukraine, because this shows that we kind of overcome the stagnation of the Brezhnev era, what I would say. We had this feeling in civil society a lot. We were lost. There was kind of lost purpose and mission and energy. But this poses a great question to many, and there's a question to civil society, how they can better use the energy on the streets. People reaching out to democracy, like you said, putting agenda of democracy back. How can Western donors support better civil society that it's more powerful? How can political parties, as a political society, connect to citizens, because to deliver European integration agenda is a political process, and without this link, this can hardly be a success. And what went wrong? Yesterday, the young Ukrainian asked, what did civil society do wrong? Is there any blame that we can put on us in a way, or it's too much to take on our shoulders? I think all these questions make me think, how can we alter the assistance that we are providing? And I have a few things to propose. Number one point for me is exactly linked to citizen engagement, and that's what you were saying. In a way, I think both NGOs and Western donors were treating citizens as consumers of democracy assistance, coming saying, well, we help you, we provide you services, we inform you about elections, go out and vote. But there was never kind of an open space where we would say what citizens, how they perceive democracy. So they speak in their own words, so that they form their citizen positions on issues, because that's what is the role of NGO, is to basically serve as this channel where citizens can express their vision about certain issues in all our countries, which are big issues of transition. And in a way, what I describe is this NGOcracy as a phenomenon where Western donors were pushing too much NGOs to talk just to government. Every proposal, you know, you had to propose a draft law. You had to propose the advocacy campaign for this law. Of course, this all was relying on expertise that a lot of think tanks here in this room have. Of course, you can design great solutions for effective governance, but how do you deliver these solutions in making work in these countries? So putting citizens back in the heart of civil society is something we all need to think how to do. Another one is, in a way, the trend that we see across Eastern Partnership region is developing of informal activism. Citizens come together as a group to solve an issue. They don't necessarily join an NGO. And this is a problem and probably a hope. Because if you look at, for example, Ukraine, we have 71,000 registered groups and less than 5% report any kind of engagement with these groups in the society. So there's a question of legitimacy. Big question of legitimacy that we all need to think, how do we engage people at the table and make them influence what we do on the ground? Finally, I think what makes a big difference is for donors to support collaborative projects. I think we need to nurture this cooperative minds. There are a lot of people in our countries across regions and at the national level working on similar issues, but they're all working apart. I mean, recently in Ukraine, some of the most successful campaigns that we've seen were really coalition and networks, like Chesno campaign, for example, before the parliamentary elections, which was a platform of 150 groups across Ukraine monitoring the quality of party candidates. They were able to put the quality of party list on media agenda, on the party agenda, and they dramatically increased awareness of what it means to be a candidate for the parliament. I think for this to happen, donors should also finance some of the projects that can be scaled up and replicated. If we know that something is working, we should share this experience with each other. And I don't think there's enough learning going on about what works to make civil society more powerful and what doesn't work. A part of my conclusions about what works and what doesn't work is, again, we need to communicate better to the citizens that what we do is part of civil society, because it's often associated with one expert or just a single man opinion, but it's something that social media is very helpful now, and I see in the region underutilized by formal groups. For example, right now on Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Facebook of Euromaidan has more than 70,000 followers, which is the great record ever on the Facebook of mobilization. None of the civic initiatives that are working now for 20 years, I mean, ever achieved anything like that. For example, the Chesno campaign that I mentioned had about 3,000 followers. I mean, you can see the scale about the potential that it offers. I understand the issue is big, but it shows us the path towards how can we use social media to reach out beyond the converted group. And I think this is something that Richard said, that we are too much speaking to each other and not enough speaking to those citizens who we need to change minds. And all these great minds in this room know how to do it. It's just we have to get out of there, which it means for us going out of the comfort zone of civil society, environment. So I think if we do all of that, and if we support it long term, and I see some donors here, for example, SIDA. I know that SIDA is now moving more towards institutional assistance in the region. And I really welcome this decision to support strong groups, to really find these groups that have legitimacy, agenda, clear strategic plan, and to provide them funding long term so that people can really work on strategic issues, not just on the project-based calendar. And if I think we go on the recommendations, I would like to see how this can be extrapolated later on for a specific case. What EU can do now for all these thousands of students on the street to keep on having hope for democracy and for European future. Thank you.
So there's probably two important implications to take from that. First of all, that civil society needs to be better linked to what academics would call political society, particularly political parties. And second, that professionalized civil society organizations need to be linked more to broader civic movements and how these are changing. And it would indeed in the debate, it'd be interesting to hear from those of you engaged in a practical sense, working on both these issues, political society and these broader organic social movements. As Odysseus said, there has been some evolution, some new movements in Ukraine at this level. then it's what is happening in Belarus, where obviously the challenges are even more difficult, even more challenging. Are there any grounds for optimism in your view?
Thank you, Richard. If I may, I would switch to Russian since I think that the most of today's participants are from AP countries, so it's more natural, I think. Я, наверное, немножко провокационные такие вещи скажу в своем небольшом докладе. Во-первых, да, в Беларуси нет поводов для оптимизма на сегодняшний день. Это показывают и, в общем-то, те социологические исследования, которые в последнее время проводились различными социологическими лабораториями. Вот одним из последних исследований по заказу Офиса за демократическую Беларусь, частью которого была Елена как главный аналитик, показывают то, что существует очень серьезный разрыв в ценностях между европейским обществом и белорусским обществом. И, в общем-то, то, что и вчера, и сегодня говорили о гражданском обществе, я могу еще раз суммировать то, что для того, чтобы настоящее гражданское общество, как его видел Аристотель, как его видел Алексис де Токвиль, как оно видится в теории, нужно даже, наверное, больше, чем 60 лет, про которые говорили вчера. Я имею в виду здесь гражданское общество, то есть не те профессионализированные организации, которые занимаются написанием грантовых заявок и работают постоянно на профессиональной основе, а скорее самоорганизованные группы, которые занимаются деятельностью в рамках своих интересов, финансируются внутри страны, каким-то образом находят это финансирование. И я думаю, что в белорусских условиях как раз-таки внешняя донорская поддержка таких grassroots initiatives, она даже скорее вредна, чем полезна, поскольку сразу такие организации попадают в поле зрения государства и, соответственно, записываются во враги белорусского государства, поскольку деньги приходят извне. То же самое можно говорить и о политической оппозиции, которая на сегодняшний день в Беларуси на самом деле не является политической оппозицией, а является структурами, которые полностью финансируются извне, и белорусами многими и государством рассматриваются как внешние агенты. То же самое происходит и с профессионализированными организациями, которые на сегодняшний день объединены в несколько зонтичных структур, например, Национальная платформа, Ассамблея продемократических организаций, но это очень маленький сектор всего гражданского общества, даже тех зарегистрированных организаций, которых сейчас в Беларуси больше 2000. Поэтому здесь очень серьезный вопрос встает, который даже, наверное, не предмет нашей сегодняшней дискуссии, а предмет какой-то большой конференции, либо серии конференций. Каким образом находить линки между вот этим профессионализированным гражданским обществом и самоорганизованными инициативами и гражданскими организациями, которые действуют даже, возможно, не зная о том, что существуют и внешние доноры, и о том, что существуют вот эти организации профессионализированного толка. И найти какое-то взаимопересечение, взаимный интерес, с одной стороны, очень важно, и очень важно для тех организаций, которые работают профессионализированно, найти выход к обществу, и сократить вот этот гэп, этот очень серьезный разрыв, который существует между обществом и гражданским обществом профессионализированным, направленным на западные ценности, на демократизацию, на либерализацию. И очень ярким примером вот такого разрыва, такого гэпа, например, является то, что после экономического кризиса, финансового кризиса в Беларуси 2011 года резко усилились против правительственное настроение, но тем не менее никаким образом не улучшилась, не усилилась поддержка и оппозиции, и НГО. То есть есть масса народу, которые хотели бы заниматься общественной деятельностью, но они не присоединяются к тем организациям, которые уже есть. Что касается белорусского политического режима, это, конечно, да, не гибридный режим, это консолидированный авторитарный режим, который рассматривает все независимые структуры как нечто враждебное. На сегодняшний день в Беларуси существует репрессивное законодательство, которое позволяет в том числе уничтожать, расправляться с неправительственными организациями. Тем не менее, на сегодняшний день этого не происходит. То есть таких кейсов, по которым применялось бы вот это законодательство репрессивного, в последние годы его нет. То есть существует реальная возможность для организаций гражданского общества находить вот это окно возможностей для деятельности и для работы с обществом, если существует такое желание и цели. Наверное, я хотел бы на этом тогда пока закончить. Спасибо.
So to come back to one of your first points, we know there's always this danger that well-intentioned support for civil society can inadvertently be counterproductive. It seems to me that one of the ways we reduce the risk that support can be counterproductive is to have a much more nuanced understanding of how civil society works and how it is structured. Katerina, we often talk about civil society in the singular, but we know there's great variation between the different countries in terms of the structure of civil society itself, but also the relationship between civil society and the political regimes. How do you think we can conceptualize this variety and understand the changing relationship between civic activity and the very political dynamics that keep these regimes in power?
Thank you, Richard. I think I'll try to recover a bit the concept we have in the title of our panel, which is the hybrid regimes. And first, a remark to sort of a disclaimer to clarify that, of course, this is not to claim or to pretend that those regimes in the region that are clearly authoritarian, nobody's trying to sort of now dress them as hybrid because it sounds a bit more attractive. I mean, there is this kind of variation in the region as well, and nobody's trying to say that Belarus can possibly be viewed as a hybrid regime form. I think what is the more useful way of using this concept is to really bring to the fore the fact that even those regimes which can't be clearly characterized as authoritarian in the Eastern Partnership and in the whole region, still are missing quite a few crucial steps towards consolidating their democratization, their democracies. And what is interesting, I think, the potential in talking about these regimes as hybrid is the fact that it's increasingly clear that this is not really some sort of intermediary passage towards further reform, that maybe they're taking a bit longer, but this is going to be still a linear process of reforming gradually, and maybe we should support civil society a bit more along the way. But still, this is sort of an ongoing process of democratization. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that it is a kind of a protracted, a fairly stable condition of having this hybrid mixture of more authoritarian structures and a certain degree of political liberty, certain institutions that would be considered crucial for democracy. And so there's this ongoing balancing act between these structures. And I think this could be a useful entry point into thinking what is similar, what unites the different countries, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, but also what renders them different, because I think what emerges from this panel and from yesterday is that there are clearly well-entrenched barriers to further reform in these countries, but the concrete nature of these barriers is actually very different in each of these countries. And the political elites are part of that, are a product of that kind of political structure, but they also obviously, the kinds of incentives and cost-benefit calculations that are being made on the basis of their understanding of what are the the immediate costs and the immediate political benefits of either allowing more reform or maybe centralizing more power. And so I think this is, this I would argue is what might help us understand a bit better the different political opportunity structure in these countries, the different nature and different degree of pluralism, but also different nature of societal dialogue and the dialogue between the society and the state. And also, as far as state and society relations are concerned, also different kinds of expectations and different forms of participation that are already emerging in each of these countries. And it was interesting to see, for example, between, in Armenia and in Ukraine, that two similar decisions were received different kinds of reactions. And so that is not to say that maybe, Armenians are just, not good enough to go onto the streets, but that is an important lesson for those who want to engage in Armenian society to really understand what are the local structures that could be mobilized, what are the local constituencies that could be mobilized a bit more effectively and could be reached out to in order to indeed maybe come at understanding what are their expectations vis-a-vis the regime. So a bit maybe to link to the first presentation about Russia. I think what the challenge in all of these regimes is that these are still very weak states, although they're not in the sense of their capacity to extract rent or a repressive capacity, but in terms of more administrative capacity. We are talking about weak states, and the fact that these states, these regimes are relying on patronage and corruption is only rendering them weaker. Yes. So this protracted nature of lack of reform, lack of sort of being stuck in this halfway house, it has a cost. So the longer this continues, the more it erodes the existing structures, the more costly it makes eventual reform for the elite. But these are also sort of relatively weak societies. So we're not facing the kind of situation where, the society has reached a certain tipping point and it's going to sort of push the inefficient, the corrupt state structures and in a kind of more revolutionary scenario. I think we are increasingly aware of the fact that that's not likely to happen in any of those regimes, but that poses very serious challenges in terms of really engaging on the one hand, the constituencies for reform, the kind of nurturing increased participation and more proactive expectations vis-a-vis the state in those societies. At the same time, finding ways to sort of support the capacity of the state without really subsidizing the one or another elite. So I think this is a bit the dilemma and the challenge in more broad terms.
So perhaps to summarize, we can say we have to understand the complexity of hybrid regimes, but also understand there are hybrid regimes, but the regimes are hybrid in different ways, which simply compounds the complexity. And in a way, we could say hybrid regimes offer a lot of potential for civil society organizations, but they should not tempt us into thinking that civic activity in these is operating in these contexts in a way that inexorably leads to full-scale democratization, which arguably is one of the traps that perhaps we've fallen into in the past. We'll finish off with Vera. Many people made the point yesterday that the civil society dimension has been particularly underplayed in the Eastern Partnership's relationship with Azerbaijan. And Vera's been looking at some of the very preoccupying cases in Azerbaijan recently. You can perhaps give us some insight into.
Thank you, Richard. Actually, it was a great pleasure to hear the insightful analysis of my fellow panelists. But I am here also in a capacity of the member of the outgoing steering committee of the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum. So I felt somehow compelled to raise again the issue of our fellow colleague Anar Mammadli, who was prevented to come to this conference. It is a kind of paradox because I remember we were discussing in June 2013 during our steering committee meeting in Brussels the developments on the ground in Azerbaijan and how the Azerbaijani legislation that is regulating among others, the registration of the NGOs, but also the funding, the way how the regime is tightening grip of following on the funding of the NGOs. And we were actually discussing how these new amendments were remodeled in line with the Russian example. So basically, it is, to me, it is a kind of paradox that Anar and his organization, the EMDS, and its fellow organization that was involved in a project that was monitoring the Azerbaijani election, fell somehow victim to these new amendments. And basically, so this is why I felt somehow, compelled to raise this issue again. And I am sure that my fellow colleagues from the Civil Society Forum and from the National Platform perhaps will add to this issue further on during the discussion. So basically, what I tried to raise is this feature that basically the legislation in at least Azerbaijan is being remodeled following the Russian case, and somehow trying to prevent the NGOs not only from to be active, but to be even further harassed because of receiving funding on their activities. And the MDS, by the way, has also a pending case with the European Court of Human Rights, because it was also prevented by the Ministry of Justice to be registered at the as the NGO in Azerbaijan. And we have many cases like this, and we will see how the authorities, whether they will be even willing to respond to the findings of the court. Then the second issue which I would like to mention in relation to Azerbaijani case is actually the fact that the community feels that there are many young people that graduated from the European and US universities that are either staying abroad, it's a big portion, but those who are coming back to the country are not actually willing to somehow engage to the civil society life. Of course, we all know that there are threats, and we know the cases of the young activists and young graduates who got in jail and who were harassed. But this was also mentioned by my colleagues from Azerbaijan as one of the features that is worth mentioning. And thirdly, I would like to tackle on funding in Azerbaijan, and that is actually that there's an inherent problem with the scale of the funding that the EU and the other Western donors are providing to the organizations in Azerbaijan, and it's quite difficult actually to match the level of funding that is provided by the regime to those that are officially recognized. So this is another feature that is worth mentioning. And lastly, because my colleagues also presented some of the recommendations, so to your consideration, I would like to mention this issue that was also, already voiced by other speakers, that within the civil society we are witnessing, or within the citizens' activities, we are actually witnessing the arisal of, I would call it, non-standard actors. I mean, independent bloggers or networks, loose networks, Orisia mentioned that. And here I see two challenges, and one was mentioned already, and that is how to fund these people, how to help them to operate on the ground. And secondly, and I think this is also a homework that is to be done by the networks of the standard civil society actors, if you like. So also, I think for the Civil Society Forum, how to engage these people, how to involve them in the work of the structures that are helping to push forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Good suggestions, and thank you very much to all our panelists. We have about 25 minutes for questions, so I open the floor. As I said at the beginning, the purpose of this panel was to be just a little bit more analytical in trying to understand and explain the way that different regimes function and the implications that this variety has for civil society. And the reason for this was that, as we all know, one of the critiques made against EU civil society support now is that it tends to be a little bit generic in nature, and several people made this observation in the panels yesterday, that support is not tailored in a specific enough way to the factors that are actually blocking reform in each of the individual states. So we tried to take a step back here and analyze the political dynamics that really condition the nature of these regimes. And perhaps we can explore what this means for the kind of practical activities that you are engaged in. So I invite questions, observations, please. If people can just introduce themselves and say who they're directing their question to.
Thank you. Gevorg Gabrielian Eurasia Partnership Foundation. I have an interrelated remark linking the issue of Russia with civil society. I'll try to make it. So we start from Marie, but also other people can react as well. I agree that the state is weak, but don't you think that I think there are some processes going on there which are very, very dangerous. In the case of Armenia, on December 2, Putin is coming to Armenia with an entourage of 600 people. It looks like an occupational plan. In the second,
600 people.
600 people are coming with Putin.
With
several heads of the businesses, several ministers. The preparation period is now, and there are about 60 advisors who have arrived after September 3 to advise the Armenian government. And the rumors that we are getting are that the government cannot work without getting the okay from these advisors. Okay, maybe that's rumors, but at least this looks much more than the calmer picture that was presented by this panel. So I just wanted to make sure if you understand, realize what can happen. In addition, in the city of Gyumri, where the military base is, there are some rumors again that the Russian government is going to take over some territories in addition for the military bases, where the entrance of people will be prohibited. So that's one thing. And connected with the movement in Russia, which is growing, the elements of democracy, my problem is, and I know Russia very well, I've lived there, my family is partly Russian. My problem is that the thing which is called in Russian classical, traditional thing, Velikoruski chauvinism, the, Velikorus chauvinism, is something which is pertinent to as the pro-Putin neo-imperialists as to the civil society and to the Democrats. So I don't count much on this democratization process, even if it takes place in Russia. I would like to hear your comments on that. And on civil society, Olesia, I think you said that professional, or others as well, professionals should be supported. Well, if you take Armenia, I think that there are very few professional civil society organizations. Well, there have been quite a lot of support, but over the years, I think that the issue with professionalism and with having all these tools is extremely acute. There is always a lack of capacity, even if public movements are some of the most interesting and advanced ones, perhaps, as compared to other things. That's the kind of positive light in the situation. And the last thing I wanted to say, one problem with this civil society build-up over the years has been that, for instance, in the case of Armenia, at some point in time, the decision has been made by EU as well as other Western support to channel major part of support via state. So do you think that in light of the changes that we're talking about today, some lessons can be drawn from that and some adjustments can be made? Thank you very much.
In terms of the balance. The gentleman here, we'll collect 2 or 3 questions first. These are great points, but if I can invite people to be as brief as possible, as we just have 20 minutes. So.
Степан Григорян, я из Армении. Ну, я вот хочу обратить на следующее внимание. Мне кажется, что Грузия и Молдова подписали. В этом большую роль сыграло то, что и в Грузии, и в Молдове шла ротация элит. Вот когда Саакашвили пришел, он привел за собой очень много представителей неправительственного сектора. То же самое с Иванишвили. Это для меня было очень странным. Он олигарх, но мы очень хорошо знаем в Грузии, кто как работает. Очень много вполне приличных, интересных людей из гражданского сектора пришли. Теперь посмотрим, что в Армении. У власти комсомольцы. Что могут сделать комсомольцы? Им приказали строить демократию, они строили. 3 сентября им сказали прекратить строить демократию. Ну, по всей видимости, все-таки Путин сказал, а не сэр Саркисян. Они перестали строить демократию. Причем, что мне понравилось, честно скажу, исключительно честные люди. Никто не подал в отставку. Все сказали, а вот теперь мы готовы строить таможенный союз. Но больше всего мне понравилась реакция американцев в Армении. Когда посольство США в Армении официально распространило заявление, что мы готовы поддерживать Армению в строительстве и реформах в направлении таможенного союза.
And please, one more. The lady there.
Татьяна Зилко, Беларусь, Белорусский союз пенсионеров. Ну, естественно, у меня вопрос к тому, кто больше всего знает, как работает общественная жизнь в Беларуси, к господину Меленцову. Господин Меленцов, может быть, вы скажете, какая белорусская организация или структура финансирует БИС? И вы живете за белорусские деньги или за иностранные? Вот, это одно. Второе. Вы не ответите на вопрос, почему люди, которые никогда не получают никакой помощи от доноров, все-таки идут на площадь и чего-то добиваются и в тюрьму. Вы лучше меня знаете, что такое обстановка в Беларуси. И еще. Где-то я уже слышала, не давайте тем, кто живет в Беларуси, они все агенты КГБ, потому что если вы им дали, я говорю то, что я уже слышала от тех, кто дает помощь. А нам сказали те, которые живут за границей, вы туда не давайте, потому что они там все агенты КГБ становятся. Конечно, большое спасибо, очень много людей выстроилось в КГБ стать агентами, я, наверное, первая. Так вот, очень хорошо, да, я сейчас заканчиваю, простите, пожалуйста, я уже всего выслушала. Очень хорошо сидеть за границей и изучать общество на месте. В Беларуси я имею в виду, наверное, точно так же и в Украине, и в Азербайджане, и в Армении. Надо бы как-нибудь вот уже изнутри поизучать. Поэтому вот... я еще и предложение скажу. Мое предложение больше смотреть на организации, которые работают именно в стране, которые и еще. Скажите, вы знаете, как аналитик, сколько за последнее время уволили людей, профсоюзников, и не берут нигде на работу? Сколько из института выгнали, сколько посадили? А у нас портфель очень такой, вот вы знаете, пустой, репрессий нет. Есть репрессии, и вы лучше меня это знаете, потому что вы все-таки соприкасаетесь с этим обществом. Простите, пожалуйста.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Marie, we start with you on the Russia point. Very brief comments on the three.
Yes, on the Russia point, which I think was a big question, then a few things also that were added. First, yes, the problem of those states, I think Russia as much as Ukraine or Belarus, is that they are regimes with very weak public institutions, very weak, from parliament to constitutional court to the media. All the public institutions have been weakened, biased, hollowed out. And so the problem for those regimes is that they have to function outside those institutions. And so sometimes, yes, they become, hostages of their own networks, and so they cannot provide public policies, social policies, and I think this is probably where we, I mean, the supporters of rule of law, more democratic institutions, we have to work on this paradigm of not just human rights, which for too long, have been seen by many as the cherry on the cake, as we'd say in French. This sort of the luxury thing that you get when the economy is starting to work better and when society feels safe, etc., etc. So I think those regimes have worked a lot on discrediting the absolute necessity of human rights, by which we really mean rule of law. That is, institutions that function with the end of impunity of the economic and political and administrative leaders. So this is the real issue. And what we know is that the Russian leadership, the Russian business, Russian big resources companies, they are working with their counterparts and trying to force the terms of the relationship and explaining that society just needs to be fed. And so I'm afraid, yes, this is where we are. And this is why, if I may sort of maybe repeat but develop one of the points I was making, which I think the economy needs to be really put at the center of our own thinking and working, by which I mean to show that it's not an either or. That is, either you have, social dependence, social welfare, but you don't have independent business, you don't have rule of law. No, I mean, you absolutely need to have both, which leads to another either or that we are fighting, that the Eastern Partnership was for, is that those societies, those businessmen in the countries we are discussing today, do not have to make a choice between a Russia-dominated region or a European, Western democratic region. That they have to, those countries have to feel, and those societies have to feel that they can work closer with the European countries and societies and businesses, and still work close with, Russian, maybe Kazakh, Turkish, whatever, other regions of the world. So I think the thinking about economic development and the absolute need of rule of law and justice for economic and social development would probably be one of the priorities, and where NGOs can gain a sort of a new respectability by being more effective in that field, that would make the citizens feel more citizens, because they are also simple consumers and simple workers. Thank you.
I think probably goes beyond the Russia point and relates to, I think, the point that Katerina made about it's not a question of strengthening civil society to the detriment of the state, but to get the two working symbiotically together. Odysseia, you had a couple of points directed.
Thank you very much for the question from a colleague from Eurasia Foundation. I think you made two very key points. One, how should European Union support civil society in a way when we see the discrimination coming from the state? In a way, what lessons are we learning? And this is exactly what I think we should use, again, the Ukrainian momentum, what's going on, to put this issue on the agenda for other countries, such as Belarus, such as Azerbaijan. I think Armenia, for the same matter. I think that in such cases, European Union should stop financing state aid, absolutely, because these are corrupt states. In this case, European Union should step up its assistance to civil society, but in a decisive manner, because I was making my calculations for our countries, you know, for Ukraine, the assistance going directly to civil society is around 3 million, between, okay, but now with new instrument, maybe 6 million euro. It's nothing, you know. For example, Soros Foundation budget is about $10 million. You know, NED is present here in the room only supporting 3 million. I mean, for European Union, this is not enough. And now European Union made a critical step in Eastern Partnership by putting civil society on the agenda. This is a great step which should be now developed further. Civil Society Forum, European Endowment for Democracy is a new instrument which can be effective and may benefit from more funding specifically to civil society, European Endowment for Democracy. And also I think, you know, in a way, the question that you raised about the professionalism, I think donors should step up a little bit from this loyalty in relationship and should really look at the organizations and say, what do we see there as their organizational development plan? How healthy they really are. I mean, because a lot of these implementing partners coming from the United States specifically, they know what it means to build the good organizations. But they were never really looking so much deep inside the groups, just funding projects. And if there are some people like you, Eurasia Foundation, in the region for a long time, I think you can change the way you evaluate organizations, and you can look into legitimacy, outreach, supporting the society, quality of research, you know, put a much more profile in how you evaluate your proposals. Thank you.
Elena?
Yes, thank you. Just very briefly, to the first speaker, to the first person who asked the question. I just wanted to actually draw perhaps some paradoxical parallels, but the EU and Russia are actually very similar in this particular case, in a sense that the EU only gives money in response to if these, let's say, the candidates meet certain criteria in terms of funding. And essentially that funding criteria is all based on the EU liberal values. And as we already mentioned, there is a huge discrepancy between values that are currently professed by the EU and values that are kind of to which a lot of people adhere in the region. So there is a huge gap there. With Russia, it is exactly the same. The only, okay, those initiatives, like you mentioned, those gatekeeping, and now only with all this entourage, only those receive funding that actually seem to kind of meet Russian criteria as well. And that's why this selective, even with the European Endowment for Democracy, the problem is still there, because the criteria is set by the EU without actually the knowledge and contextualization, and not in response to the local needs. And that's where the problem essentially lies. And also, the second problem here is we need really to have those local hubs, local people who platform who would be able actually to instead of avoiding this further professionalization and actually still that would lead then to selective funding, but would work with those informal groups at large, which are out there and which may not necessarily meet the EU criteria or Russian criteria for that matter, in order to support them in their particular initiatives.
Michael?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to dwell on the call that lady from Belarus made, call for reality check. Well, that's actually the title of our forum. Well, and the reality is, and here I would also refer to the colleague from Georgia, reality is that these regimes cannot do systemic programs, systemic changes, but they are good at aiming individuals. And next year we will see the problems for leaders of civil society in Ukraine and in Russia. In Ukraine, it will start in January with the beginning of presidential campaign, and in Russia after Olympic Games. So my call is to colleagues from bilateral and multilateral donor organizations. Please reserve, if possible, some funding for support for emergency issues for the leaders of civil society organizations. Free media, pro-democracy journalists, pro-democracy intellectuals, who will see the grave future, and the variety of the future is either illegal criminal cases against them or destroyed careers. Basically, both cases are part of that reality. So please help with this. My second call to donors is also to think about strategic initiative, creating smart networking between civil society organizations in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Well, this summer, I had several cases trying to help my Russian colleagues to re-register their organizations in Kiev. Well, that's because in Russia, they were having less and less legal possibility to exist, to operate with their bank accounts, to perform their activities, and we got problems in Kiev as well. So these two things are part of the reality that we are checking now. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis, please.
Thank you, Richard. Я бы хотел тут ответить на такой эмоциональный достаточно вопрос госпожи Зилко. Что касается БИСа, то да, действительно, он, как и многие организации профессионального толка, финансируется извне страны. Что касается исследований, то здесь можно в частности спросить у господина Манаева, который проводит регулярные исследования внутри Беларуси, и все те опросы, которые проводятся, они проводятся методом face-to-face, то есть здесь никто не изучает Беларусь извне как какого-нибудь подопытного кролика, с одной стороны. Но пафос моего выступления заключался в том, что если мы пытаемся строить настоящее гражданское общество, ответственное именно белорусское гражданское общество, то это гражданское общество должно быть самоорганизованным и самофинансируемым. И пока внешние доноры строят организации в Беларуси и в других странах по принципу патрон-клиентельских связей, до тех пор общество будет воспринимать эти организации как не свои и как навязанные извне. В Беларуси существует множество организаций, пока не политического толка, скорее такого социального, энвайронменталистского толка, которые приходят постепенно к самофинансированию, к тому, что сами граждане участвуют в финансировании тех проектов, которыми занимаются эти организации. И я думаю, что если мы говорим о долгосрочной стратегии построения такого общества, и политической оппозиции, и гражданского общества, то мы должны задумываться о том, как осуществить вот эту смычку общества и НГО. И я думаю, что одним из механизмов является как раз-таки поиск внутренних источников финансирования и укоренение этих структур внутри страны.
Yeah, just a quick remark, mostly in response to the first question by the Armenian colleague. I think when you mentioned the Russian chauvinism issue, I think it links to the broader challenge, which is a really difficult one, and it's not only about donor assistance and kind of democratization programs, specifically in Eastern Partnership countries, but really more broadly. And it's a big analytical challenge as well, what to do with civic organizations, locally rooted, that are bonding well, generating social capital, but are not representing liberal values, right? And I think this is sort of it's a big analytical challenge in general for kind of civil society theory, and it's a very practical challenge as well. How do you promote certain kinds of organizations? So let's say, do you give priority to certain kinds of organizations that you think are the right stakeholders, the right kind of lobbying force for the kind of reform that, as a certain normative community, the Western community is trying to help develop? Or do you try to also have an impact on kind of broader pluralism and the broader dialogue structures in this society? And so kind of a dialogue as a value in itself, as something that has to be inclusive, and if it's inclusive enough, is likely to generate as a sort of, as Elena also mentioned, this sort of eventual result of more tolerance, more social capital, more kind of skill for dialogue in the diversity that civil society, as we know, is supposed to represent, right? It's not about a particular ideological project, but it's about sort of a plurality of views. So I think your point raises a very subtle and complex challenge.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything?
Yeah, thank you. Briefly, perhaps only comment or follow up on what Orisia was saying about the EU funding. I think there is quite a lot of EU money actually going to the Eastern Partnership countries. The issue is how it is spent, and then we can
And where
and when, and there we can see that the large portion of money is channeled either via other international organizations like Council of Europe that implements projects in various policy areas in the EAP countries, or via big consortia of consultancies that are actually putting the civil society organizations into the position of subjects,
Yes.
not owners of the project. So basically, I think this is also our role as analysts to look into these ways and channels how the money are spent, and perhaps try to push the EU to somehow reconsider this policy. And second issue, the emergency provisions, how to help the people that are really in danger on the ground. And again, the provisions in the legal basis that they have been there for ages, like with an EIDHR. Again, the problem is with the implementation, because, for example, to hand in cash for an EU official to a person on the ground, it's almost impossible task. So somehow to improve these delivery mechanisms.
Okay, we're into the last 5 minutes, so I'll invite just 2 more questions, and please be very, very brief. Have the lady here and the lady here. Please, very, very brief, because we're...
Joanna Kurs, Civil Rights Defender, Sweden. Marie was talking about the need to support economic actors and other actors of change in Russia. I was wondering if you could develop a little bit how you imagine that, taking into account that we've seen a major movement of donors out of Russia during the last years, most recently because they've been thrown out by Russia, but previously also because Russia has been considered a country that has enough enough good economics to sustain its own civil society. Thank you.
Okay, the lady here.
I have a very short question. I think this discussion about connecting professional NGOs and society is for me really weird, because I'm not sure if the expert society understands that it is their personal challenge. It's not the challenge of the people. And I think the starting point should be here, because this smyczka paradigm is really, it's too much, I think.
I couldn't quite hear. You hear? I couldn't quite hear.
And the gentleman here, but please, very, very brief. Just take 1 more.
Владимир Корягин, Конфедерация предпринимательства Беларуси. Мне очень понравилась аналитическая панель, и поэтому я вопрос задаю. Вообще мы о будущем думаем, пора приступать к созданию форсайта гражданского общества. Форсайт не только технологическое предвидение, последние годы применяется не только к экономике, но и к общественным процессам. И только в рамках этого создания форсайта мы можем моделировать как краткосрочное, так и долгосрочное стратегическое планирование. Меня очень впечатлило то, что произошло в Москве 30-31 октября, когда в Москву были приглашены организации гражданского общества, сотни, и шел форум, на котором детально расписывались системы контрактов, финансирование гражданского общества. Одним словом, власть очень серьезно отреагировала, и она хочет стать основным донором гражданского общества. И, следовательно, оно будет расколото на агентов внешних и внутренних. Это надо, хотелось бы знать, какова реакция аналитических центров на это.
Great. So I just invite anyone who does have any reactions to that, and also perhaps to go back to Mikhail's first point about last practical recommendations that you would have. I mean, people have gone away from the summit saying the civil society dimension is key to reactivating the Eastern Partnership. Just final thoughts in terms of if there was kind of one key idea that you would put on the table for the next summit, what it would be, as well as replying to any of those specific questions, but very, very brief.
Yes, very brief. So maybe I'll answer the question about economic action of some kind. First, I'd like to stress that I think the economic aspect of things is part of civil society in the way we define it. Just take one example related to Russia, which I know better than other countries. Small entrepreneurs have been victims of the regime in recent years because they are small entrepreneurs, and more often because they have a wife or a husband who is active in journalism or human rights organizations. But there are dozens of them, like Olga Romanova and her husband, who was in jail, I think, for almost 2 years, which shows that the clientelistic regime is very much aware of its lower capacity to deliver economically and socially. So I think this is really the point I'm trying to make. Now, how to provide support for independent economic actors in Russia, I think it's really outside the realm, particularly because we are talking of the Eastern Partnership. But just maybe to stress one important point, which I think would be part of the recommendations, is that we are not talking of two camps, fighting for Armenian society or economy, we are talking of the European Union, with a program, with a purpose, with an objective, and open not only to the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership, but other countries like Turkey and Northern African countries. And on the other side, we have a post-Soviet failing zone, dominated by Russia, but also with Kazakhstan and with, China in the background with Shanghai Cooperation. So it's very, very different. So I think one of the messages that we have to work on in those societies is that it's no longer, a post-Soviet region facing, a post-Cold War West, that it looks very, very different, and not get caught into this new East-West conflictual rhetoric, which is certainly not in the interest of the societies we are trying to support and accompany. Thank you.
Thank you. Just brief comment to Irina on why is it the problem of formal groups. It is a problem because if they want to remain relevant, they have to change, and it's a problem for donors who are pumping millions through these organizations. If we want to have an effect, we need to, as donors, ask questions and ask right questions to these groups. Now, if I have one thing to communicate today to the European Union, having in mind all these thousands of people, and let me just emphasize, not only in Kyiv, in Donetsk, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, and in other places, and this is the first time that Ukraine is united around the agenda. We are usually doing the clashes in the kind of opposition to each other. But my message is basically, if government of Ukraine failed European Union in signing association agreement, Ukrainian society did not fail, and Ukrainian society is screaming very loudly to say that we want Europe and we want democracy. So in this case, I think European Union should reconsider the assumption that civil society is there to cooperate and help the government, because it's not. Because the government does not want civil society at the table in Ukraine, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Belarus. And this is clear. So if European Union accepts this assumption, and sways away from the liberal understanding of civil society, where very often we see civil society at the table in liberal democracies. We should understand that this civil society needs also funding to communicate European values to teachers, to policemen, to doctors, to students, to explain what it is on a day-to-day basis. And I again refer to great exchange programs that US government was organizing to explain what it is, called Community Connections, running professional exchanges on 1 month all over United States to explain American model. Europeans have to better explain European model. The business is not done, and just to finish on the slogan of Euromaidan, everything just begins. European Union wanted everything to end here in Vilnius, but this is not a good news. And good news in the same way. Everything is just beginning now.
Great, thank you. Elena.
Okay, thank you. Just
Everyone
very
else,
briefly.
please brief, because we're into coffee break times.
Indeed. I just wanted actually to disagree that economy may necessarily lead to democracy. I think economy might actually lead to stability, which we often confuse with democracy. And just one thing that I want to say, funding is clearly a problem in a sense that it can work as an instrument that can tear societies apart. It can create that divide, internal, external.
Yeah.
And I think what is more important actually to shift the focus from funding and funded bodies onto the society itself. And that's why, yet again, I'm coming back to my initial argument that education is at the heart of it all, because if we actually are there to raise responsible, critical citizens, that's where actually the actual capital lies, because that's when we can start questioning.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, two short points. First, this post-Soviet world is created by elites that very well cooperate with each other. They are very good at isolating their countries and improving their regimes. That's first. Well, they need an equally strong response from civil societies, from united civil societies, cooperating, and that's the idea of my first proposal. Second, I would like to react on the foresight. There are many methods. Foresight is equally as good, and it should be promoted. And I know that, at least in Russia and Ukraine, there are cases of using it for political reasons as well. Thank you.
Очень кратко ответ на вопрос господина Корягина. Да, действительно, такие попытки предпринимаются, в том числе в Беларуси, когда власти пытаются создать свои государственно-общественные организации, и здесь никуда не уйдешь от конфликта, потому что, да, государство создает свои общественные организации. Опять-таки мы возвращаемся к проблеме несформированного вот этого grassroots гражданского общества. Государство пытается сформировать свое через финансирование, там, в том числе западное, Европейский Союз, международные доноры пытаются как-то промотировать свои либеральные ценности через создание и поддержку организаций другого типа. И этого конфликта в ближайшем будущем не избежать, хотя, в общем-то, как вы говорите, форсайт должен быть и нужно об этом задумываться.
Very briefly, I think a lot has been said, and I think the EU specifically is increasingly aware of the subtle challenges that political or kind of more proactive, politically active civic organizations are facing in these different countries. I think some of the ideas that have been voiced here are crucial, including the kind of intra-regional cooperation. Another sort of more concrete suggestion that I would like to pose is that maybe more can be done, because the EU is so good at kind of sectoral cooperation and more development work, but maybe more could be done to link that to the more broader strengthening the society agenda as well. I think that's kind of the kind of challenge that doesn't make the respective regimes particularly edgy or uncomfortable, so there's probably more space to do more work in that realm, and that probably would be one of the channels to strengthen these weak societies we talked about this morning.
Great, thank you. And Vera, final word. No.
Just for the EU to stick to its norms and principles and to deliver flexibly and innovatively support to the civil society.
Great. Okay, well, thank you to all the panelists. We'll take a coffee break here. Please join me in thanking those speakers. So we have a coffee break until 11. I was just asked to announce a practical point. If people want reimbursements, they should do it now in this coffee break. And we'll come back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.